Hey guys, let's chat. So, I want to say there's been an increased discussion surrounding mental health in the media over the last few years. I'm sure all of you all have noticed that people are making it more speakable, so of course we're talking about it more. And one of the more commonly mentioned mental illnesses that I feel like is publicized a lot is PTSD. So my guilty pleasure is love and hip hop. I'm a love and hip hop head. People like, oh, you still keep up. I ain't got no life. The drama is still a thing. It's still funny. So yes, I indulge. And something that I noticed, Love and Hip Hop Miami and Love and Hip Hop New York, they kind of ran the same. They ran the same season, like they came on right after each other. And in both locations this season, there was one person who suffered from PTSD, and that gave me, the kind of push to be like, hey, let's talk about PTSD in the Black community. Both of the victims on Love and Hip Hop, they both are shooting victims as well. And being from Chicago, I know how prevalent that is in our city. So I felt like by having that footage to refer to, this was a really good time and opportunity for me to educate you guys about it. I didn't want to talk about PTSD and assume that people knew what it was. So I'm going to start off this video by giving you a small education piece on what post-traumatic stress disorder is. So that way you all have a frame of reference. You're not just here for the laughs and shit like that, but you also learn something. Outside of that, I just really want to highlight the fact that even though we typically hear about PTSD related to veterans, right? That's how it really became popular. What we have really been able to see, at least for me as a therapist and as a clinician over the last few years, that PTSD is a diagnosis that a lot of people are carrying now, because essentially if you endure something that is traumatic, you most likely exhibit a lot of these symptoms. And so while yes, we talk about it in relation to being a veteran, but we also have sexual assault victims who have PTSD, domestic violence survivors who have PTSD, police officers, EMTs, people who see death on a day-to-day basis, they can have PTSD. So I really want to educate you all as far as widening the spectrum of what you think of when you hear PTSD. So that's why we're going to get into the education piece of this, where I have my trusty dusty psychology Bible, okay? And I'm just going to take you guys, I'm going to read you guys pretty much the criteria required in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, so that way you can see how how common some of these symptoms are, and you've probably recognized them in other people that you know who've been through something very traumatic. And so yeah, I'm just going to refer to this because I don't want to leave anything out. PTSD is actually one of the diagnoses in the DSM-5 that is it's very long, very descriptive. And so I've separated pretty much the things I want to focus on. Right. So you have to have had exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So directly experiencing the traumatic event, so it happening to you, witnessing witnessing the event as it occurs to other people, learning that the traumatic event has occurred to a close family member or close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental, and experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to the graphic details of the traumatic event. So this applies for like people like first responders who like collect human remains, and again, like I said, EMTs, like the people who have to go and deal with scenes of death after the fact, police officers, things like that, who constantly hear about the gory details of the case. Recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event. Recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and or effect of the dream are related to the event. So pretty much just bad dreams. Disassociative reaction. So some people have what we call flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event is actually occurring. reoccurring. And intense or prolonged psychological distress and exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble. So you go somewhere that looks like the place, that feels like the place, that smells like the place, and it triggers a memory, and again, it causes you psychological distress. And then physiological reactions to these internal and external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event, beginning after the traumatic event has occurred. So, avoidance of or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings closely related to the event. Avoidance or efforts to avoid external reminders. So, not going around certain people, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations because they bring up such distressing memories for you, thoughts or feelings, because they closely remind you of the traumatic event. So, inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic event. So, again, certain details may leave them, certain important details may leave them because in the moment sometimes people disassociate from the event, so they may have bits and pieces of what occurred around it, but any main details are probably non-existent to them. Persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself or the world. This is something that I feel like people can more so understand and relate to. So feeling like you're the bad person, feeling like you can't trust anybody, the world is completely dangerous, that you can't go out in the world and navigate it the same way because it's turned bad on you or whatever. Persistent distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the traumatic event. Again, leading that person who's experienced it to blame themselves. Again, sometimes we call it having like an affected God complex, where you feel like you have the power to have changed whatever occurred, and we have to constantly remind people that they're not that powerful. Persistent negative emotional states, so people who are constantly scared, angry, guilty, or feeling shameful, anxious all the time due to the event. Diminished interest in participation in significant activities, so not really wanting to do things that used to bring you pleasure and joy. Feelings of detachment and estrangement for others, not really wanting to be around people and isolating. Persistent inability to experience positive emotions. So again, always feeling like there's a dark cloud over you, kind of like I mentioned in my video about depression. Reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response. So again, you accidentally sneak up on somebody and they have a whole fit, maybe start crying, have a panic attack, all types of things. Problems concentrating and sleep disturbances. So difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep. So some of these symptoms do align with depression, but as you see, a lot of this, the onset of it has to be after a traumatic event. So I hope that gives you guys a better understanding of what PTSD actually is. And now we can go ahead and move into what we're going to be chatting about today. All right, so this topic is so big and deep where I didn't really want to address it by myself. So I have two guests who are going to help me really break down what PTSD in the Black community and in specifically Black men looks like, and how we can do better with supporting people like this. So can you guys just take a second, introduce yourselves? Name, age, education, current career paths, all that good stuff.
Okay, so I'm Shantae. So I have both a master's in social work and a master's in education. And my career path really focuses on critical consciousness development programming for young people, and anti-racist, anti-oppressive professional development for teachers and school leadership and staff.
Yes! Okay.
Hi, my name is Willie. I currently have my bachelor's in elementary education, and I have a master's in curriculum and instruction. And from the west side of Chicago. Am I missing anything?
Okay.
Currently a teacher right now. I've done everything from take kids to the White House to meet Obama to sitting down at the table for half the children.
Okay, so now that y'all know a little bit about my guests, to start our discussion, we're going to jump into showing you a clip from Love and Hip Hop New York, where there's a cast member by the name of Maggie She is rapper Mano's girlfriend, and Maggie is a nightclub concert shooting survivor. And what we're going to really see in the clip is a very good demonstration of how Black people typically respond to people who have PTSD and the struggles, internal struggles that they deal with as far as not really knowing how to heal from it, and again, feeling supported by the people around them. So take a second and look at these next 2 clips. Okay, so I'll start with my personal opinion. I think that there is a lot of misconceptions in the Black community about how people should or do recover from a traumatic experience. I think it's unfair. Like, we see Yandy and Mano pretty much say, like, you got to heal from, you got to get past this, or you just got to get back out there. And I really think that it's unfair to just say that as a solution instead of being like, hey, maybe you should go talk to a professional so you can learn the tools that are going to help you heal. I think that, like, so Mano, we saw that he took her to the place where she got shot. And I think that his intentions were good, but I also feel like he tried to do, like, some impromptu exposure therapy. That's what we call it in the field. And it could have went really left and, like, left her re-traumatized. So, I don't know. I just feel like a lot of times Black people don't always have realistic expectations of how somebody heals from something that can be very traumatic in their life and really affect all areas of how they navigate this world. So, did y'all like pick up on that, or is it just me?
Yeah, I think consent is like a huge part of that, and I think when we're working with students or people in general around the healing process, like, people really have to be in a space that they want to do that. And so I think that something that was missing from her experience was her own, like, determination to go into that space and to do that. And not having that, I think we missed a part of that healing process for her. So I think it was kind of interesting. I mean, sometimes we need people to help us, to push us to do things. But also there's power in us being able to take that step ourselves and to be able to do that with the support of people around us, to know that, like, when we are ready, we have people who can go with us and go on this journey with us. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how she felt. I think that's something we had to kind of ask her, like, did she feel like she got a chance to experience that in the way that she wanted or not? But I don't know, that's something I picked up on.
Yeah, I think that in his reaction, he kind of did what some guys might do, is like, okay, I'm gonna do the best thing that I can think of to kind of solve this problem. I don't think that putting her in a position by surprise was necessarily the best thing, because surprising anybody with a traumatic experience is, you asking for them to relive. And if they gonna relive, then you gotta be there for them as they reliving. And then not only in that moment, but after that moment as well.
Right.
But I think that he did the thing that people do commonly when something bad happens and they don't know what to do, which is
and you care about that.
Yeah, and just to ask, are you okay? Okay, well, let me help you get past this point. I think that that was something that he might have wanted to change if he could do it all over again. I mean, just asking her opinion would probably help too, because he would get more insight into, okay, well, how is this going to look when I go here? How are you going to react? like that whole time of them standing outside, I can just imagine how lonely she felt even with him there.
Yeah.
Because that situation, you know what I mean, was much bigger than just him being there now. So
yeah, and I think you bring up something really interesting. So in therapy, when we process trauma, because that's the word that we use, we do it in a way that is very calculated and meets the client where they're at. You never want to push the client past the point, but you also don't want to let them be okay in
being content
and being content with where they are and what they've been through. So you slowly start to meet them where they're at, and you again you look at the situation and think, okay, what can I start to implement, or how far can I challenge the client without them being re-traumatized or extremely emotionally overwhelmed. And again, when you pointed out the fact that it's not just what happens in that moment, but after that, that is why, a lot of times in our groups, we tell the clients you can't start talking about something that is very traumatic for people or triggering for people, or something that's like really in depth. And when we say that, we're talking about things like sexual assault, like any type of violence, trauma, pretty much, like to not drop that at the end of group, because then it creates a discussion and people are left to leave group with those feelings and nowhere to talk about or a space to process it. So I think that is a big part of what was lacking. I'm curious to hear what you all think about as far as like the Black community kind of feeling like we can put BandAids on things instead of like really going to the lengths that we need to heal from certain stuff.
Well, even like backtracking to the last point, I think there's also a level of trust that you don't want to abuse in a relationship, where if I trust you and let you in on like something traumatic, or like I don't want you to get to a point where now I can't trust you to tell you how I'm feeling or what I'm going with, because in fear of I don't know how you're gonna respond, or what you might push me to do or make me to do if I'm not ready.
So in your experience, Will, do you feel like you've seen youth not really being able to deal with things that are happening at home out of like the perception that they're going to be judged for it, or again that it's not, they're harboring the fact that, oh, it don't really bother me, when you see it manifesting in other ways?
I think that it's almost a compounding issue of they don't know how to talk about it because we don't know how to talk about it. And we don't know how to talk about it because we've never seen the generation before us talking about it, right?
Yeah.
So in those situations, they just doing the same thing that we would do. They trying to be strong. They trying to cover it with how they look, their material stuff. They trying to cover it with all type of different actions that might speak more towards their personality instead of what's actually happening. But oftentimes people will put a Band-Aid over things because they don't know any other solution, for real. And we as a community, we kind of withhold that information. Like, we'll talk about what hurts us, but we won't talk about what heals us a lot. And if we did more of that, then kids would automatically be like, oh, okay, my great-grandmother went through this, so okay, I get that. But we don't even know what our grandparents went through.
Right.
Because
that was grown folks' business too.
Yeah. And even sitting there and in a room full of grown folks talking, how much did you actually give to that conversation? Probably zero.
Right.
So you pretty much not retaining any of that because you were barely there. You were just there listening.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of what I think about Band-Aids, and how essentially students too do not mind putting a Band-Aid on things, because sometimes that's the most easiest thing to find is a Band-Aid. Sometimes you need surgery, but you can only find a Band-Aid. So, what you gonna do? Cry out?
Right.
And if you do cry out, then how are you gonna be judged for that? All type of different things, to where it looks so foreign to talk about what's wrong with you, or to talk about not even what's wrong. That's bad connotation. To talk about what's going on with you, it looks so foreign to the point to where kids don't want to do it because they haven't seen an example, and if they do, they feel like they might be judged.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of really good points with that, because essentially, like what I said earlier, is PTSD doesn't just come from the stereotypical way that we have learned about it in the last couple of years. Like, a lot of our youth are growing up with PTSD, being from Chicago and having that nasty stigma of violence, even though we are not the worst, but we still unfortunately have that nasty stigma of violence. And a lot of our youth, I feel like they're going to be struggling with this in the upcoming years, if not now, because they don't know or have a space in which they can deal with the feelings or even understand that this is what they're going through. Like, as we're gonna see in the next few clips, I think it's unfortunate that the Black community, a lot of times, they don't have the words or the names to go with a lot of the things that they're experiencing. And then one day when they read about it or they hear about it, then it clicks for them like, oh shit, that's what I have. Like, I've been dealing with, X, Y, and Z, and I never knew that that's what it was. Shantae, I'm interested to hear your take on if you feel like we sweep things under the rug, we put Band-Aids on it, we don't really allow people to address the trauma that they may have been through in the Black community.
Yeah, I think so. I think 3 super important points. Like, the first is the process of healing and processing these emotions is learned through generations. And there's no way that my children are going to be able to process them in healthy ways if I haven't, and I have not taught them to be able to do that as well. And so that's super important. I think first, and I think second is to also think about, a lot of what we talk about, or a lot of, things that when we mention PTSD, are things that have happened, right? But what's happening with our students is still happening. And so it's a lot harder to talk about healing if we're still in the process of that trauma, if we're still being traumatized every single day. And so it's harder for us to imagine what healing looks like if we're still in the midst of that process. And so that's something that we have to address, and we have to talk about, that this is not something that has happened to our students. It is present, and until we get to a point where we've eradicated poverty and we've done all these things we can for communities, it's still going to happen for families. And so I tell my students that we have to be prepared to heal from traumas of yesterday, but we also have to be prepared to heal from the traumas of today and tomorrow, because it's going to continuously happen. And the third thing is, I see a lot of people forcing mental health and mental wellness initiatives on Black students and Black families, where it's like, and nothing's wrong with yoga, nothing's wrong with all these different things, but sometimes, if they're not created by communities or by students, it makes it a lot harder for them to feel connected to them and for them to use them as healing processes. And so our healing processes have to be created by us, because we're the only ones who know what that process, and what we've been through. And so I think, and there are a lot of people who create these, a lot of initiatives for Black students or Black people in general, but that's something we have to keep pushing, and ultimately people have to fund. Like, we see people funded. Like, I was talking to somebody who, was a white woman who was like, I really am very passionate about, acro yoga and doing this in schools with predominantly students of color. And I was like, that sounds fantastic, but they don't know what that is.
Right.
And it's just like, and it's harder for them to use that as a coping mechanism if it's not something that they can do at home or with other people, or, and so it's like, we have to find things that are accessible, but also relatable. And they have to be stuff that's created by us, for us. And that's just not something we see being funded and pushed as often as we'd like.
I think that that's really interesting, because I feel like what's lacking is, again, of course, I feel like getting mental health more so talked about in schools is a big deficiency. But I see certain educators trying to do a better job of like implementing these things so that we can start with the younger generations and hopefully work on them enough where we start changing a lot of these narratives and a lot of these problems that we're having. So like some of the things that I've seen on Facebook is like, I think I saw an article not too long ago about instead of detention, doing like meditation in schools. And I would think like, that is a really good idea, and I really would hope that somebody, again, is working with these young children to explain to them what meditation is. I deal with clients who don't understand the basis of mindfulness and meditation. So, again, you want to give people things that are going to work for them, and expose them to different types of coping skills and modalities, because one thing isn't going to work for every person either.
I kind of agree, but I mean, in ways like, that hierarchy of needs, right? Like, if a kid don't feel safe,
Maslow's hierarchy.
It ain't gonna matter if you trying to do yoga, if you're trying to do whatever those things, until you satify that need of that child feeling
that
safe,
stability,
they're not gonna be able to start healing at all. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So
that's a really, really good point. And I know we talk to the clients at my job about that a lot, because essentially, like you said, with a lot of your basic foundation missing, like we tell them, we know if a client does not feel safe at home or in general, they aren't going to be able to heal, which is why, residential treatment is so popular. You bringing people out of that environment, you giving them structure and safety and stability for a certain period of time so that they can deal with their trauma, all the skeletons that they have in their closet, and you really set them up to have success for when they go back into maybe a not so good environment. And teaching them the education of how all of that contributes to their mental health. But I completely, I agree with that. Depending on the populations that you're working with, it has to start with some of the things at home before they can feel like they have a space to grow anywhere else outside of that. So now I want to just kind of turn our attention to the Love and Hip Hop Miami clip, where we see, we're going to look at a rapper that they have on there. His name is Chaotic, and he talks a lot about his PTSD from being a victim of a drive-by shooting where he was in his car and he was shot up. He ended up getting caught up in a case which really triggered a lot of his PTSD symptoms, and he talks about that. So we're going to take a moment and look at those so that you kind of have a frame of reference and where our conversation is now about to go. I just think it's unfair for the justice system to sentence Chaotic and say he did all of these things without taking into consideration his mental health and his PTSD. Like, that man clearly has been through some shit and it affected how he navigated that situation. And I just think that it's a lot of black men who would have had that same response. If you got an unmarked car following you, you don't know who they are, you gonna try to get the hell out of Dodge. And like he said, he thought for somebody that's been shot while in a car, he thought somebody was out for him.
Just think about, how scary that is as a human to
be,
you know what I mean, being followed by somebody else, right? And then you put that on top of what he's been through with cases and dealings with police and just seeing police officers in general and not even knowing this. But I will say that the justice system has no laws in there about trauma and black trauma and what black trauma looks like. If it did, then there would be millions of KKK people in jail, but there are not, because there's no conversations about trauma in the justice system with black people, for real, from what I see.
Absolutely. And I just think that even outside of his situation, there's so much that black people do that kind of, I don't want to say that it's paranoia, but we are always on our P's and Q's, and I think we're taught to be on our P's and Q's from a very young age. Like, me and Shantae was just talking earlier, and she was saying how her mom would take her to different spots in the city and test her knowledge on where she was at, just for the sake of her gaining an awareness, being black, being on the South Side, and knowing where she was and where she was going for her own safety and her own protection. And I feel like we all kind of get little things like that. Like, I know a lot of black people, when we go to restaurants, we want to sit where we can see the door. We, a lot of black people, like she mentioned, like Maggie mentioned, don't like crowds. So it's like all of these little innate things that I think we as a culture have kind of learned to do because of post-traumatic experiences, and that could be generational. You know what I mean? We just always feel like we got to watch our back, and I think we feel like that more than any other culture when they step outside.
And I think a lot of it too is, we adapt and we find ourselves becoming people or doing these things in order to survive, right? And so that becomes who we are and what we do and what our day looks like and our week looks like. And it's unfortunate, but don't like crowds, or when we don't like certain things because it's traumatizing, that's the way a lot of systems or institutions are set up, and they don't really accommodate for people who've experienced trauma or who have similar experiences, and so we miss out on a lot of things. We cannot be a part of a lot of mainstream things or a lot of things that are happening, and it limits us because we can't, we haven't been able to process that, or places haven't been created in a way that accounts for a lot of feelings and experiences that we have. So it's one of those things where it's definitely perpetuating systems where not only am I already marginalized because I've been traumatized, but now I'm re-marginalized again because I struggle to be a part of what's happening in other spaces. Right. And so we also didn't think about how we're leaving a lot of people out of a lot of things that's happening because we don't accommodate and because we aren't welcoming for people who are currently traumatized. I think something that was also interesting from this last video was, as the guy was talking about his traumatic experience, his friend was talking and he mentioned something. He said, you got to get out of the hood. And to me, that's something that's such a frustrating statement that, we equate success as making it out of our communities instead of being able to transform them and to stay. And so that's always just something that I find so interesting, because the goal really shouldn't be to escape poverty or to escape our communities, but to eradicate poverty or to eradicate, the violence that lives within our communities. And so, because ultimately,
he was essentially saying the best answer available. This is what you need to do, and this, you need to come spend more time with me. And
those are the BandAids. Those are the BandAids that I'm talking about.
Talk to me as a person. Yeah. But then I think that people have to learn how to have that conversation to where it's not the surface level. Are you okay? Hey, what happened?
Yeah, people don't know how to be genuinely empathic, where they're just sitting with somebody, even if, because a lot of people, they don't like to feel uncomfortable. So if they know that you're upset, and you being upset, they don't know how to help you, they feel uncomfortable. So they're just going to, again, that's why I refer to those as BandAids. Oh, it'll be okay. Hang out with me more.
But I think a lot of that is still tied to feeling powerless in that sense, where it's your only option is to leave, right? Instead of saying yo, that's messed up. Because, I think somebody who has maybe felt more empowered in certain sense or had access to ways where they feel more empowered, might have said, that's crazy, that's messed up, we got to do something about that, right? And just even hearing the differences of how people respond sometimes says a lot about how they feel about their community. And it's true, we don't have a lot of power within our own community. It's crazy how this is our community, but it's really not, right? We very have little stake and very power in them, or people feel like they don't have a lot of power within them, right? And because we can hold power to a certain extent. And so it's just a very frustrating statement, I think, and sad, and not oh, I'm angry, but it's just sad to hear people feel like their only option is to leave everything that they've known, or the places and people that have raised them. They feel like that success means that I get away from that, because it can't mean success for me to stay here.
And people say that about Chicago all the time, and I think it's just I find it so saddening when I hear people say, who moved and either say, I'll never come back to Chicago, or people who feel like they have to move in order to have any type of success or to just feel safe.
I think it also just says a lot to, if we work with students, it says a lot to our students too. If our students are from the south side of Chicago and we grew up here, but then we moved to the north side, but then we come back and now we teach them, what message does that also send our students if we are leaving communities that they're from, or if we no longer want to be tied to communities that where they are? And so even thinking about the not so explicit messages that we make when we move, or when we do certain things like that. But I don't know, it's crazy, because so many of our teachers commute. So many of our teachers don't know what's going on in the neighborhood where our kids
to my school every day.
And it's crazy, and I think that has a lot to do with a lot of things around job availability and whatever case may be in certain communities. But we get a lot of predominantly white teachers who come from neighborhoods where, and a lot of communities on the south side are similar in a certain thing. We go through very similar things. So I might live in, Bronzeville or something, and might teach in Auburn Gresham, right? You know, it's something like that where it's like, okay, I might not live in your community, but maybe we have some sort of similarities or overlaps in some of the issues that we're dealing with. But our education system is an overwhelming amount of white teachers teaching predominantly black and brown students, and they come from neighborhoods where like you ain't got no overlap of like what we going through, and it's harder for them to make that connection. You know, and for students that's hard. And when we talked about our education
that's
system,
a traumatizing situation.
It is.
Yeah, I wrote a piece called "Sit in the Chair and Submit, Boy," and it was just a piece about like how you'll take a black boy and sit him down in the chair for hours
and talk at them,
and he looking out the window, and you're upset with him for looking out the window, and the sun is giving him life. And he can't use none of that. He just got to sit there. And how that could just be a traumatizing thing to go through for the next 12, 16 years. To where if he cannot sit down, then how do we send you as a adult?
Right.
What type of punishment do we give you as an adult, right? If you cannot sit down. So, you know what I mean? Education in a way can be traumatizing too, because it can really filter ideas into kids about how things are supposed to go.
And that's what I was going to say.
And like, who's giving them information?
And that's what I was going to say. Like, depending on the messages you're sending them, that education piece is huge. If you either have teachers who are like Biggie, who say, you gonna grow up and you ain't never gonna be shit, and that's the type of life you're speaking into these kids, that's traumatizing, and that changes the trajectory of the rest of your life, and how you feel about yourself, and how you perceive the world, and how it treats you, versus having black educators who are speaking life into you and letting you know that you can be anything that you want to be, and to not let your experiences stop you from being as capable as you can be.
Because it's traumatizing, I think, for me, if my whole life, you know, it was a poll that was going around on Twitter that was asking people when did they have their first black teacher or first black male teacher, and some of the responses were like, I didn't have one until high school or college or things like that. It's like, imagine going your whole life and thinking that the only holders of knowledge are people that don't look like you. And like the only holders of knowledge are people who come from communities outside of yours, right? Like, it's so important for us to have people not only who look like us, but from our communities and who've experienced a lot of same things, who are also showing kids that like we all hold, you know, knowledge.
I think that learned PTSD is something to kind of discuss too, because I mean, as you were talking, I know a lot of people who have fears of a lot of things that they've never even seen in their life, but they learned it from somebody else being scared of it, right? And they learned it from somebody else being scared of something. So something originally happened, and then now you got a whole generation and generations of people who are now afraid of something because something happened. So I think, you know, as much as we don't talk about PTSD, in certain ways we do, and we overwarn sometimes, right? And we overtell, hey, well, you need to make sure you avoid this, you need to make sure you avoid that, you need to make sure you avoid this, to where, you know, a person ends up going somewhere and just being anxious all the time.
And guarded,
One of the biggest things that I was able to see with my students when I was working at a youth center on the southeast side was that, you know, and every sound that they heard, it was a look around. And it didn't matter if the sound was the printer. It didn't matter if the sound was a gate closing outside. But you know what I mean? Just that trauma in that gives them almost a sense of hypervigilance. To where, you know, they always got to be on guard. They always got to be ready. And they'll never get a chance to relax. They'll never get a chance to actually enjoy something. Because they always got to be hypervigilant or trying to figure out the way that they're going to solve the inevitable, when the inevitable most times does not happen.
And that enjoyment, I think, sometimes to them represents vulnerability. Like, if I let my guard down, I'm vulnerable to something occurring outside of me that I can't control. And one of the things that you said earlier struck the thought of me, like how we can be at an event, and if black people see people running, we're gonna run. We don't care. We don't have to know what the agent is.
Naturally.
Like, I would hope anybody.
But I don't think some other cultures do that though. I think some people would like kind of
stop and be like, what's going on?
What's going on, guys? Like, I really feel like that. Versus like black people, we don't need to see that. We getting the hell out of Dodge.
Well, we also see the signs of safety and security as certain things too. Like, I mean, we look at ambulances and police cars a lot different than other races might look at ambulances and police cars. We look at, you know what I mean, a group of people running and just be like, I should probably be heading away too. Because something in your inner blackness is like, if it's chasing them, it could chase you.
All right, so do you guys think that our systems overall contribute to PTSD in the Black community?
Yeah. I feel like education does it in ways. I feel like policing does it in ways. I feel like there's a lot that just goes into making sure that Black folks remain scared. Black folks remain fearful because you can, you know what I mean, out of a fearful person, you can pretty much guess what they're going to do easier than somebody who's not in fear. And I think that a lot of that is geared towards, you know, putting Black people in a position to where it's like you always going to be looking around just expecting a drop. I wrote a piece called No More Martyrs because in talking to some Black men, and them being like, oh, I'm gonna be one of the greatest Black men ever. They're gonna have to kill me, and I'm like, first of all, they're not gonna have to kill you. Second of all, they're not gonna kill you because we're gonna protect you. Third of all, why do we even feel that way? And we feel that way because, you know what I mean. Our natural thought is that if we're doing something powerful, something is going to happen to us.
Yeah.
When that don't have to be the case if we all looking out for each other.
Absolutely. So. And it's crazy you bring that up. So I talked on my Instagram not too long ago about the fact that I was pulled over on a Sunday morning at like 7:30 on my way to work. And, you know, I was, okay, whatever. You giving me a ticket because I was speeding. But
that's where you going?
I think he said I was going...
100.
Nah. I think I was going 48 and a 30. Okay. But, again... It was Sad Street. It was, again, 7 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday. Anyway, I was fine or whatever about the ticket, but what pissed me off is, so as he gets in his car to leave, he pulls off, and then while he was writing me the ticket, I saw another officer on the opposite side of the street pull and sit, and then when he pulled off from behind me, I saw another officer pull off from behind him. And I'm like, since when do you need 3 police officers to do a fucking traffic stop for speeding? Like, I remember when police only call for backup over serious shit. Why is it that it's 7:30 in the morning and 2 other police officers don't have anything else to do than to sit and observe and accompany him while he's writing me a ticket for speeding? And I just think that that's crazy. And I notice myself even saying, like, when I see Black men or Black people getting pulled over by the police, I circle back around. And it's just because I feel like with the way things are nowadays, somebody needs to be a witness. You know, and even if I can't sit there the whole time, I still just try to, you know, look out.
Well, you know, the Black Panthers used to, they actually used to, if there was a traffic stop, they would literally call over to whoever was riding around, or people would just stop and stand there and be a witness.
The police.
Yeah. So, I mean, at a certain point, the police can't do too much because you got 35 people watching you opposed to, you know what I mean? Now, if somebody pulled up, you speeding past and like, haha, y'all ain't get me, but y'all got that person. So, yeah. It was
super, I don't want to say I was scared, but again, for me, it's like, why do you need this much manpower? And when I talked about it on my Instagram, somebody came in my DMs and was like, you know they do that as a scare tactic. Like, they do it, like you said, to keep you in line, to keep you with a certain amount of fear of authority, because without that fear, they feel like they don't control what they need to control in their world, in their systems. And
agree.
I just think that it's crazy that...
Because I think that's a part of, like, emotional and like mental PTSD.
Yeah, you know, that's what it all is.
And it boils down into like it kind of drips down into your physical, so it touches a part of you every time, because now you're not only thinking in a space to where it's PTSD, but now your hands are shaking. Yeah. Now you feel a little, you know,
the anxiety triggers kind of.
Yeah, all these things are happening just because of this one thing. So yeah, most definitely.
But I also think it's important too, like you asked the question if we felt like our systems, our current systems and institutions are re-traumatizing. And I think that we have to realize that current systems and institutions were not designed by black people,
Right.
and they were not created for black people. And so in a way, they've always been traumatizing. So as they continue to exist as they always have, they will continue to be re-traumatizing for black people. And so, you know, we think about that, like you mentioned schools. I think our education system is important. When you mention when people go to the restaurants, I know students who didn't want to sit with their back facing the doors. Mm-hmm. And so if we think about why we need more, you know, black teachers specifically in classrooms to restructure the way classroom spaces look like, to restructure how we talk about certain things, to restructure, you know, the curriculum and the way that we engage young people that looks differently, because it should, for students who go through something completely different than the rest of the country, you know, at home, their schools should also represent the fact that they need spaces that look completely different than the rest of the country. And so, you know, and even when you think about the police, and that is an institution, right? Like, a lot of people want to talk about, well, you know, not all cops are bad and they focus on individuals, but it negates the fact that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have one or two or a few good cops, because it's an institution that they work for, right? That's inherently racist, and that some people are arguing needs to be, you know, redesigned, and others are arguing needs to be abolished. And if we think about the fact that none of our systems were ever designed for black people, we have to realize that most likely all of our systems still are re-traumatizing for black people in that same sense. And, you know, you talked about vicarious trauma and all these different things, where even if we haven't experienced these very blatant or I guess like these very blatant or explicit acts, right? We know about them, and we've seen them, or we know people who have experienced them. And so in some sense, all of our institutions play a part in this in our systems, because we don't hold power in them the way that we need to and we should, but we are affected by them at disproportionate rates, but the power that we hold is disproportionate compared to the rest of the country. And like, that's always going to be a dynamic and an issue that like we have to change on multiple levels.
And I don't think a lot of people really understand that, because when we think about, like you said, police, the whole idea of police as a career is an institution in itself. And then we see, like, when things happen, I see a lot of the public getting upset, like, well, the black cops that are there, they're not doing anything. And then I compare that to, like, when Obama was in office, a lot of black people felt like Obama wasn't doing enough. And it's like, they can only do so much within a system that is still over them, that is still, where they are still considered beneath whatever role that they are holding. So essentially, it's not, I think it's unfair to like try to put all black problems on the backs of a couple of black police officers. And then of course for them, like, they still got mouths to feed. Yeah. So essentially,
well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I think to some extent we have to think about that. But I do feel like if we do make it to spaces where the majority of black people are not, we do have a responsibility.
No, I completely agree.
And so while I do feel like, you know, I think we do need to think about though, kind of not even the pressure, but like what expectations are we putting on people? Like we do want to hold them accountable for that, but like it does look different, and it's not something that like you can just come in and I'm about to change the system myself overnight.
I think it has to be realistic, and I think a lot of black people have unrealistic expectations for people in these spaces. Like, what's the new lady, Kim Fox? Is that what is her position? State's attorney. When the shit with R. Kelly hit the fan, she was doing her due diligence on that. And a lot of black people were like, well, Kim, why you worried about R. Kelly and we got all these unsolved murders? And that type of narrative pisses me off, because I'm like, people have the capacity to dedicate resources to multiple things, especially somebody in her position. So let's be glad that she's doing something. And even if y'all feel like it's working against the black community or it's not for the black community, for a lot of people, that's justice and that's something. And so, again, doing what you can where you can, but not having like unrealistic expectations that these people are just supposed to go in there and erase 500 however many years of racism.
And I think that's different, though. I think we can still ask for people to be radical about these things. Like, I think you have some people who are more conservative in a sense where they like would take different steps or slower steps, which, you know, I'm not going to argue whether or not one was right, but I do feel like we do at some point we do ask people like, okay, we need something different. You can't just come in and do the same thing, and we can't afford to wait for you to figure out how you want to change the system. Like, we need people who are not afraid and can go in and to do, you know what I'm saying, X, Y, and Z in those spaces. But you know, and you know, we talked about police as an institution, and you said three cops pulled up, you know, for your traffic stop, and yeah, it is used as a scare tactic, but we also got to realize that's a system that they've created to keep themselves safe and for them to feel that way. And so that's why the Black Panthers were so influential and so powerful, because they said, well, we're gonna create our own institution and our own system to make us feel safe and to do that. And so thinking about how if we, and I love the fact that, you know, people who are police abolitionists who say, well, we don't need the police system that currently exists. We can community police ourselves, right? It's like, if your institution was not created with me in mind or to keep me safe, then we don't need it. We'll create our own. And I think that radical imagination is something that Black people need. Like, we get to a point where we have never experienced anything other than the way that the world exists right now, that we can't even imagine what a world will look like where we're free, or a world where we have the ability and the capacity and the power to change things. So
I think the only thing that locks us into that thought then is PTSD. So I think that is such a huge weight towards Black folk feeling like they're free, because even Harriet Tubman said, you know, I would have freed so many more slaves if they knew they were slaves. They were suffering from a PTSD to where they weren't even slaves no more. Right. But they was just like, this is what we do. This is what we do all the time.
But I think an activity that I still can do with my young people when we talk about imagining what their communities look like, right? And what do they want? That's a form of healing, in a sense, where we're radically engaging in the process of redesigning our own communities. And then we take the steps, and then what does that, and then we offer them the steps of then what does that look like, what has to change on a policy level, what has to change, you know, on a community level or personally, but also like it allows us to then have those conversations with each other around then what can we do and how do we heal, how do we get there. But I think like we have to. And it doesn't, and not everything will work for everybody. So I'm not saying that if we just get people to radically imagine the world, we'll all heal, you know. But like that's still something that's so powerful in a different way of asking young people to be able to talk about their experiences and reimagine that space.
I think that's the important point, is speaking on that.
Making it speakable.
Yeah, and actually using that in our conversations, because again, the conversations about PTSD and trauma are so less to where when we're talking about, we can talk about anything else but hurt. We can talk about anything else, but what is really causing a lot of our issues. And if we have spaces to where we can reimagine as well as go back and look at the past and say, okay, how do we make sure that it looks like this, but we don't do the same thing? And I think that can be an even more interesting activity to patent pending.
Yeah, because I feel like that you have to, like, we know that like there's no way you can. What's the quote, like? If you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. Yeah, I feel like I think we do our students a disservice if we don't talk about what's come before them. And so I think that is a good point. That sometimes you do have to say it, because maybe some people don't realize that. But whenever I engage young people in radical imagination about what we want the future to look like, we've been having or will continue to have conversations of what the world has. Because also it's like we can't think about what we want the world to look like if we don't know what it's already looked like. If we don't know, where we've been confined, right? And to talk about that bubble, there's no way they can think outside of it. And it's crazy because so many of our students have, it's hard for them to think outside the bubble because they've never even physically been outside of certain bubbles within our communities. But
I think it's crazy. Like, so when you described that, I immediately got into my mind movies like Divergent and movies like Hunger Games, where like they're post, something very dramatic. And there's a whole new way of life and how things are, and the way that things technically are now is like a fire mystery, gone in the wind. And a lot of the plot in those movies is we see how a system has managed to control the minds and the openness of a bunch of people. And that's the crazy, that was like what came to my mind when we speak about people not knowing what is out there or what could happen, because somebody has ingrained in them that this is the way things are and this is the way things should stay. And we don't grow from dynamics like that. something else I want to touch on is I think we get easily traumatized now more than ever with social media, to the point where I know for me, when shit happens that is traumatic, these shootings and things like that, even stuff like that girl who was sexually assaulted on Facebook Live, like I've had to get to a point where when that shit come down my timeline, I make the decision to not click it, to not look at it, because by us continuing to look at videos like that, we are further desensitizing ourselves from what is considered to actually be a traumatic experience. People are so normalized to some of these behaviors and these actions where it's not hitting them where they should, and for me, it still turns my stomach. Even, again, because another part of PTSD that I mentioned earlier is the fact that it doesn't always have to be just directed at you, but if you are a witness to something, which we essentially all are, every time those videos of a cop shooting a kid, or again somebody being assaulted, it just was a video of a guy kicking a 78-year-old woman in the face, just seeing things like that, I feel like it really does something to you on the inside. Like I'm that video that just came out, that man kicking that lady, people may not even see that and think that, oh, that's traumatic. But that's so traumatic to witness something like that. And again, I can't imagine what the people who were actually there in the present witnessing it felt like, because a lot of the regret that people with trauma live with is feeling like they were helpless, like it was nothing that they could do, or going back and thinking about, oh, well, what should I have done in that situation? And it really affects, again, how they move through life with holding on to some of these thoughts. So I'm curious to hear what you all have to think about, like the whole idea of the fact that now we have social media and a lot of people's trauma is being showcased for everybody to see.
Yeah.
I think I'll start by saying, like, I think consent is, again, like, something that's kind of important that sometimes gets left out of these. Like, I feel like it's so important for us to see things that are happening, and I don't think that we need to hide the world from what's really happening on a lot of things, but I think there is something to people, like, that's somebody's story.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that, like, people should be willing and have the power in telling their story to some extent, right, about certain things. And and I think that's something that social media has really taken out of that. Like, people are not able to willingly share their stories. And that's just something to consider. But it's also like, it's as important as it is for all of the videos and all of the social media movements and all these things, we are not required to traumatize ourselves in order for us to be motivated or inspired to take action, right? Like, just because we see it, we do not have to sit and watch it over and over again for us to feel like we're angry or like, we want something to change. So as important as it is for be there, you still have to be able, and part of that mental health is knowing, your limits, and your self-care is to take breaks from looking at that. And that doesn't make you less of an activist or less of a concerned citizen or, a black person in that sense. But that's something that also is not talked about, right? We're not required to put ourselves through that every single time we see it on our timeline for us to be angry and to want something to change and to be activists in a sense.
And I think, real briefly, I think some of these sites need to do a better job at, maybe having a shadow screen over a lot of that stuff where it says, like, sensitive content. So that way you just not scrolling and bam, there it is, like already going.
You need a trigger warning.
Right, like I think some type of, and I think Instagram has that feature. I've seen that on like Dr. Pimple Popper's videos now, where she'll have, it's like a sensitive content because that's gross to people. So I feel like any video that has like content like that, I think they need to do a better job of policing it and making sure that it's just not there and you don't even have, you can of course keep scrolling and once you realize like the extent of it, but initially, depending on what it is, your eyes already caught there. And I think it's sometimes people's natural reaction to look at shit like a train wreck where you want to look away, but you're there. But like you said, a lot of that comes with, it comes with like your boundaries and your own mental health, like your care for your own mental health. Because I know for me, once I know it's even out there, I'm being cautious when I'm going down my timeline if I know that's not something that I even want to see.
Yeah, I'm also writing a book called The Black Male Social Media Experience. And And I kind of think social media overall is traumatizing. Like, I've seen memes, so I'm just like, what? How?
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? And then reliving something that I just read. So I already know, you know what I mean? That video piece is strong too. But when I look at that, I just look from the viewpoint of a child.
Yeah.
And I just look and be like, okay, just like I grew up with Tagged and just like I grew up with MySpace and all these different things. So where I can tell you the layout and the code, one day they're going to be able to do that as adults. And what code or what layout are they going to tell you of the things that they see, the experiences that they see, the trauma that they see on people, and the situations and the feelings and experiences that they see is real. Because some of our young folks, they can see a video of a murder and they don't see it as real, even though somebody really died. And I feel like that's kind of trash in itself because kids don't even know that they're being traumatized.
Yeah.
People don't even know that they're being traumatized until it's too late. Until you go into work and you wondering like, oh, why do I not want to be here? Why do I?
Why am
you know
I so
it's
irritable?
war on
Why?
you so much. Yeah. So I kind of got to be for social media right now. So, because of that traumatizing effect.
Yeah.
I think also something to highlight is that, you know, we talk a lot about institutions and systems, but the media, our news stations, are institutions. And right now, we do not control the narrative of these media, like these news stations. And what social media has allowed us to do is to be able to share our stories and to kind of change the narrative. And so even when we think about, you know, the violence that we see, like, I also know that, like, I learned so much from social media, which is so crazy because why I don't like watching the news, because if I watch the news, I'm seeing so much negativity around the violence, and that's why you get a lot of people that'll say, well, you know, people in Chicago only want to protest when a white police officer kills people, but they don't protest about, you know, the violence in their own community, and it's like, that's crazy.
Because we
do.
And
And it's like, and I learned so much about, you know, Black empowerment and the movements and initiatives that we have from social media, because we control the narrative of what we want people to see that we don't get in other institutions or on other systems or platforms. And so while it's one of those things though, it's like we still got to figure out in what way is that beneficial and still supportive and helpful for people. But that is something that it's allowed us to do, that we don't have that power on other systems, but we need to be able to tell our stories and to get these stories out, which is so crazy, the amount of stories from people that I've heard, that I've learned from social media, right? And not on these other platforms that everybody has access to just from turning on the TV or the papers that get dropped off at your doorstep every day. Imagine how little control we have on those, but to click an app and I can learn all about families and
you got a lot of blogs and that cater to stuff for Black people. It's for us, and it's Black writers who are putting the content out there. So I agree. And just to touch on something that you said earlier, I think it's unfortunate when we don't have that consent from a lot of these people who are going through crazy public traumatic experiences that get put out there for the world to see, because essentially that can re-traumatize them time and time again. Imagine trying to heal from something, and every time you look up, you can search your name or a hashtag, and there's all of your most deepest, darkest traumatic experience
that you may not be ready for.
That you aren't ready to deal with yourself, and now you have to be in a space where you know 1 million and however many people across the world have seen this.
The access to information.
And I think that there are ways to do that, to still get awareness out without putting identifiers out or without putting people's safety and mental health at risk. Right? And I think that we've seen people say, you know, please share the video because I want people to know what happened to me. I might not be ready to look at the video, or I don't want to see it, but I want other people to see it. Or, you know, I've been in situations where, you know, I was in a group or an environment, right, in a city where something had happened, and the person it happened to was not ready for their name and their face. It was like, I want people to know, but please don't share my information yet. When I'm ready, I will share it.
I'm just realizing that that's post-traumatic, is that we have to go through all of that to get some type of result. Like, we got to go through 1,000 views on our video of us being illegally, you know what I mean, searched by the police for somebody to actually care. But one person to actually care in real life. We got to go through 1,000 views or ask for people to participate.
Right,
or get the right celebrity to see it, and then they post it, and now it's the thing. without feeling like, again, these systems that are supposed to be in place to protect us aren't going to do anything about it. I literally,
but again, I think that goes back to, like, again, you know, and it is sad that, like, it takes so much, but there is that piece of, like, that power where now I'm ready to tell my story, so I'm ready to put that out there. Because even when we talk about people who are victims of sexual assault and rape, right, like, you can report it or you cannot. Like, it's really when you should be, you know, your choice, and you can talk about it but not be ready to do a step after, you know, like, you can take it to as far as you're ready and then you're not. And so I think a lot of that really goes back to, you know, what is enough for you right now, and how much you want out right now. And it's crazy too, because people are so wild that, like, they be like, I want the whole story, or like, oh, I'll get bits and pieces, and it's like, well, I'm gonna figure out the rest, or something gotta be up, or, you know. So sometimes we don't even allow people to tell what they want or what they're ready to talk about, because we be so thirsty or wild or inconsiderate, where we like, you gotta tell us the whole thing, or, you know, X, Y, and Z, or whatever the case may be. But
well, I want to thank you guys for coming and helping me really, like, tackle this subject, because again, it's a lot. It's so many levels to it, and I felt like the Black narrative of PTSD was deserving of being told and explained to people so that they understand what it looks like, and maybe start to think below that surface level of, this is how things are presented to us, but this is not how things really are. So thank y'all so much for coming and spitting out that education. Look, 2 masters, okay? A bitch only got 1, they got 2. They put me to shame, okay? But y'all enjoy the rest of y'all, what's today? Monday evening. Look, I'm off for 2 days, so I don't know where I'm at. Y'all enjoy the rest of y'all evening, and yeah, thanks for coming to our little TED Talk.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This must be how I feel to be on Oprah. So,